of which 100% of the proceeds go to support nonprofit organizations, which also assist other victims of domestic violence. Some people may not believe that I am a survivor of domestic violence. They're entitled to their opinion. I'm supporting this cause because it's very, very important to me. These are only a handful of examples. I've never been to prison. I don't know from personal experience what it's like there. But I'm certain that after I arrive, I'll likely find many other ways in which I can contribute to the women there.
Yeah, Mark, when you hear that, what comes to mind when you first heard that?
Okay, first of all, I paused it a number of times. My wife and I just looked at each other and we literally just yelled. It was just silly, like the Mother Teresa of murderers, as I said tonight on Dr. Drew. The only thing missing, Jordan, the only thing missing, literally, was her saying, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there are thousands of prisoners with allergies, and I will go up to each one of them and say, God bless you, every time they sneeze, or Gesundheit, and I will do it in Spanish and English and sign language, whatever. I mean, it's ridiculous.
It's true. But that part with with the shirt really seemed to tickle for a lot of people because the jury rejected anything that he was, a monster like that, and for her to bring up there with a shirt.
Well, not necessarily. Let me say this to keep it fair and balanced. Everyone says, well, they rejected that. No. There was no separate verdict decision as to whether they believed that he abused her. They just believed that she didn't face imminent death or great bodily harm and was not justified in killing. While I believe that he did not commit any acts of domestic violence against her, the jurors could still believe that she was a victim of domestic violence, yet believe that she committed premeditated murder. I don't think that they feel that way, but I just want to correct the record. I think that people are not legally or factually correct to say the jurors rejected that she's a domestic violence victim. They didn't make that decision. Their decision was very limited.
Right. Now,
the point I was making was enough already. Rudy Gaudet, serve your time. I don't want to hear anymore. The highest court in Italy has said this case is over. And those two have been released. And why are you dredging this up again? Why don't you show a little remorse? Why don't you apologize for what you did and don't tell people you were in the bathroom when this happened, when you've taken a plea and your blood and your fingerprints are there and you're the one who fled to Germany and had to be apprehended. All right? Show some remorse. Why don't you apologize to the Kircher family?
Yeah, and that is a sign of guilt when you do run away. In the U.S., at least, that's what they refer to as consciousness of guilt, right?
Correct. Flight can be used as consciousness of guilt in an argument.
Now, this Steven Avery story has been huge, both for Netflix, both for stories. What is your take on the whole thing?
Well, I have said a couple of times publicly that if I had to vote on his guilt or non-guilt, based upon what was in the documentary, I couldn't have voted guilty. So I've been, digesting the information that's come out that wasn't in the documentary, and it's interesting, and it's not good. I mean, he seemed to have a little obsession with Teresa Halbach, and, it's not good. My question, though, and I'm not satisfied from anything I've heard yet, is I want to know where she was killed. I want to know where she was killed because to me she wasn't killed in Avery's trailer or bedroom. If indeed she was shot, there just isn't any forensic. If she was shot in the garage, I mean that garage was a junkyard inside, and there would have been spatter and spray that could not have been cleaned up. It couldn't be possible to clean up all the blood. So if she was shot, she wasn't shot in the garage of the trailer, as far as I'm concerned. And then if she was on his property and he'd say he killed her in the trailer, or maybe he strangled her. I don't know. Maybe she went in the trailer and he strangled her. But I don't believe she was shot. Yet that bullet fragment, which was found on, some later search in the garage underneath some stuff that has her DNA on it, I mean, I found a little suspicious. Not a plant necessarily, but a little suspicious because I do think there was contamination. And there is contamination in cases, and it happened again and again. it's like, why is her blood in her car? Like, what's that all about? Why would he how'd that happen? So
it
I'm
seems like
confused.
the documentary, I don't know, tell me if I'm wrong, seems to be a little biased towards the defense in this case. What do you think?
Well, I know the documentary filmmakers would disagree, but the truth is that they had access to the Avery family. They had access to Steven Avery. They did not have access to Ken Kratz and the Halbach family. So what they did was they tried to balance it by using the press conferences and courtroom footage of openings and closings, and so they had the other side there, but they weren't following them around and sitting down and doing their own interviews. So yes, it does seem to have a bent, toward the defense side because that's where they had access. But I do think they certainly made a good effort to show the other side.
Oh, absolutely, and judging by that, but this all began with a vicious rape case back in the day that he spent 18 years, which eventually he was exonerated through the DNA. Now, if it wasn't for that case, that this probably wouldn't have gotten a second look. Your thoughts?
Probably. You're probably right. Yes. Okay. So this is a guy who is either the unluckiest guy in the world to be first wrongly convicted, the rape victim apologizing to him, spending 18 years of his life in prison. He's out for 2 years, and then he's arrested again falsely, is what he wants you to believe. I mean, what? How is that possible? But I think if it weren't for that rape case, where he had a $36 million lawsuit against the county because they really did have the true rapist in their sights at one point and didn't follow up enough. They thought they had the right guy with Avery. And so he had a good lawsuit there, which he settled for a nominal amount, $400,000, that simply went to his defense in his murder case. I don't think the case would have gotten the same amount of attention. But the Innocence Project, they dropped him really fast, right? He was like the poster boy for the Wisconsin Innocence Project. And, of course, they dropped him real fast. And I spoke to a friend of mine who runs an Innocence Project in another state about Avery. He doesn't really know the case well, but I just had a question about him, about the forensics. And his name is Greg Hampikian, and he runs the Idaho Innocence Project. And he's a DNA expert because I wanted to know if there's such thing as sweat DNA. I'd never heard of such a thing, and nor has he. There is no such thing as sweat DNA, okay? No such thing. There can be DNA deposited as a result, but you cannot tell that that's the source of it, okay? And I think what happened, and I have the trial transcript, but I haven't looked at it. I think what happened is if Avery's DNA is underneath the hood latch, somebody probably said an argument, and likelihood members of the jury that came from his sweat, or an expert said on the stand if asked, well, how would someone's DNA get under the hood latch? Well, if you're sweating, you could leave it, you could leave some cells, some DNA, something like that. In a lab, you do not say, oh, look at this DNA I have here, that came from sweat. No, okay? And it was a totally new term to him when he was like, sweat DNA? Who's saying that? So that's just kind of a phrase that we've adopted, and we assume it's from, and it might be truly from sweat, but scientifically you can't tell that. Scientifically.
Right.
But that's compelling evidence. Yeah. Okay, I think that's good evidence against Steven Avery. Anyway, I think I was digressing. I was getting off topic.
No, but yes, those are very valid points. The Innocence Project didn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, and nobody wanted to go near this. That guy, right, Jordan. What that guy was telling me was that he remembers at the time. Okay, so this is now 2000. Okay, he's exonerated 2005. She's killed in 2000.
No, he's exonerated 2003. She's killed in 2005. He goes to trial in 2007. So my friend remembered like the 2005 to 7 period, and he was like, "Yeah, nobody thought at the time there was like any problem with the proof against Avery. Like this was not."
Police say just days before his son's death, Harris watched videos about hot car deaths online and even allegedly searched how to survive in prison. Just 2 months ago, Harris's wife Leanna filed for divorce. But as Cooper's mom, her attorneys say she will testify and intends to defend her ex-husband.
Leanna has never wavered. She thinks that Ross did not do this intentionally. Whether he was sexting or whatever the salacious allegations are, that it was not purposeful, that he left Cooper in the car.
And jury selection could take as long as 2 weeks. The father faces those murder and child cruelty charges, but he's also charged for some of those explicit messages that day with a minor. Robin, this is a complicated case.
It certainly is, Gio. Thank you.
Okay, Jane Velez, this sounds like a Casey Anthony case, except it's a male. And there's sexting, there's how to look up, there's Googling. What's your thoughts on this tragic case?
Well, I think it's horrific, and I studied the details of this case. He took his little boy to Chick-fil-A for breakfast, and then claims he forgot him and went straight to work instead of dropping him off at the daycare. And I don't buy it for a second. And in my book, Addict Nation, I wrote about sexual addiction and addiction to porn and how the Internet has supersized this form of addiction, because you can have as many experiences as it would take you a year in real time in just a weekend online. And so that's what he was doing. He had all these relationships going and all this raunchy XXX rated sex. And, all addiction leads to incomprehensible demoralization. And it gets back to exactly what I said at the beginning, that the addiction, the substance, the behavior, whatever the substance of choice is or the behavior of choice is, hijacks the mind and works for the addiction. So right. I believe, and let's let him have his day in court, obviously, but I believe that, the moral bankruptcy that came with his obsession, his addiction to these sexual escapades online, robbed him of any moral compass.
Good evening, Joey, and thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us here on King Jordan Radio.
The pleasure and privilege is mine, King. Nice to be with you.
Okay, most of the legal stuff that has been significant in the HLN world has been the Dr. Martin trial. What was your take?
I think the jury got it right, thank goodness. And I think the prosecution overcame a lot by the way they presented the case. Because if you remember, Jordan, the major points that the defense were making was, one, alibi, and number two, the lack of medical evidence, right? Scientific medical evidence. And they were able to dispute that in a very powerful way by, in their case in chief, the prosecution that is, talking about how the alibi was far from foolproof and poking holes in it and speaking about his behavior at the safety fair that he was at, how he was in a rush. And I think that really, really gave the jury a clear sense about the deficiencies of the alibi. And then with regard to the whole medical testimony and how the defense was saying, look, you know what? The medical evidence isn't there. It was inconclusive. It was an accident. And then the second autopsy is classified as a homicide. They were able to bring their own experts to say, hey, wait a second, you know what? This was a drowning. And so I think that by launching that preemptive strike, they did themselves a great service, that is the prosecution, in securing a conviction.
Now, did this case remind you of the Drew Peterson case at all?
Well, interestingly enough, every case, of course, stands on its own merit. There certainly were parallels, with regard to the evilness of both people. and with regard to the ultimate and the lies and the inconsistencies and, you know, obviously the ultimate act of homicide. But, you know, this doctor, oh boy, he brought evilness to a very new limit, you know, not only with regard to the crime of which he was accused and ultimately convicted, but all of the things that he did leading up to it. I mean, talk about, you know, we did a segment on what was not admissible in court in terms of, you know, him attempting to kill his mom, or at least saying so by poisoning her, his indication to his other mistress that he killed his brother. I mean, just one thing after the other. He was a pretty wicked man, and I think, you know, ultimately he's paid the price for that, so thank goodness.
Give me your take on the prosecutors. I heard another legal analyst say, you know, it wasn't a Juan Martinez, and I don't think you could get that anywhere else, but a lot of people I heard felt he was a little stale and boring, and but ultimately he got the gold at the end of the day. But give me a grade for the prosecutor. That prosecutor.
Sure. Well, you know, he gets a grade of an A because he got a conviction. You know, it's sort of, you know, at the end of the day, no matter what your style may be, and there are different types of approaches to it. Some people are more flamboyant. Maybe some are more articulate. You know, some have better oratory. Some are more enthusiastic. You know, but at the end of the day, it's the result that matters. And so different attorneys do things differently. You know, and we can all look and assess each other as far as how effective we are. But if you get a jury to go your way, no matter what you say about the attorney, I think it's a tremendous thing. If you can remember, speaking of drawing parallels, you know, if you look at Casey Anthony and how people were attacking Jose Baez, he's young, he's not experienced, this is his first case, he's a disaster, he doesn't know what he's doing. But guess what? He got his client acquitted. It's very controversially, of course, but what I'm saying is ultimately, irrespective of people's views about the attorney and the prosecutor in this case, and, you know, whether he was flamboyant and whether his cross-examinations were, you know, that excruciating, he got a conviction. And so anybody who gets a conviction, if you're a prosecutor, you'll get an A from me. So there you have it.
Let me ask you about bringing in the convicts, the jailbirds, the snitches, if you will. Was that a risk by the prosecution to do that?
You know what, Jordan? I think that was effective. I mean, you know, ultimately, when you have a witness, any witness is judged based on credibility. Is what they're saying believable? Can you rely upon it? And does it have any bearing upon the case? And I think even though they were jailhouse snitches with checkered pasts and everything else, a jury was able to hear and ultimately, I gather, put some credibility and credence into what they were saying, and that is that, hey, I killed my wife. And so it's always controversial to use jailhouse snitches because the cross-examination is, hey, you're a criminal, isn't that right? And you've been convicted of fraud, right? And you're not truthful, and you're a convict, and you're in jail, and you're just saying this because you want to get out. Isn't that true, sir? And we shouldn't believe anything you say because of your checkered past, your bad character, and the flaws that you have as an individual. But I think in this case, you know, the prosecution was able to successfully use some of that testimony to establish that, you know what, this is a bad guy, and this is a guy who ultimately committed this crime and admitted to it. And so I think it was effective at the end of the day, Jordan.
And also, we had a very unique character in this case. I think people always remember Gypsy. Give me your take on Gypsy. Do you think they could have done more with her defense, that is?
Good old Gypsy.
What do you think of her?
Good old Gypsy. I think
that's her real name, too.
Gypsy Willis. I think that, you know, Gypsy was important because she established motive. Right. And whenever you have someone that establishes motive, and we have to understand that we have to understand that motive never needs to be proven, right? That's not the job of the prosecutor is not to prove motive. It's not an element of the offense. But with that stated, jurors want to know why. They want a hook to hang their hat on. They want to know why someone would have engaged in the crime that they did. And so I think Gypsy was the linchpin. They were very successful, the prosecution, in saying, listen, this is a man that's smitten by Gypsy. He would do anything to be with Gypsy. And as a result of that, him wanting to do anything to be with Gypsy, he would kill his wife. And if you look at his conduct as it related to Gypsy, feigning that she was the nanny, moving her into his home, merely weeks later, the texting at the funeral prior to that, proposing marriage to her thereafter, the $7,000 ring. There were too many things there which would establish that he was just hell-bent on being with her. And so I think when the prosecutor was able to put that before the jury and they were able to examine and view that, they said, look, this is the reason that he engaged in this evil act of killing his wife. And so when you show the jury the why, and then you're able to piece together circumstantially the other evidence that establishes the how, you have a pretty compelling case. And I think that's what they were able to do, the prosecution, with, I think, great success because they got a conviction.
But basically, I brought you here back in October, and you said this was a waste, this trial, George Zimmerman, and so far you seem to be right.
It's pathetic. The police investigated this case. They held back. They were continuing an investigation, and then all of a sudden, due to all the media pressure, they've got marching orders from the state special prosecutor, arrest this guy and charge him. So rather than even go to a grand jury, they rushed, they filed murder 2 charges against him, and the circus began. This is such a ridiculous, insane, pathetic, disgusting prosecution. I really have to tell you. Look at what they did. Look at what the prosecutors did. I mean, they basically laid out the entire defense for Zimmerman. They basically proved nothing on their own, nothing derogatory, and they certainly did not prove murder 2. They completely were deficient in satisfying the elements required, especially the depravity element. And so that case should have been dismissed. But when you have a judge who also has her marching orders and is not sitting there like a real intellectual jurist, but rather someone sitting up there biased in favor of the prosecution, you get what happened today. She denied the motion to dismiss. So the case goes to the jury.
Yeah, no question about it. And it just seems like all the witnesses they bring in, they turn to defense witnesses, 80% of them.
I mean, it's ridiculous. And the ones that didn't turn, I mean, it looked like they got their heads screwed on that day. I mean, they didn't even know what they were talking about. I mean, the one witness gets up there and says, it was so dark I couldn't see. I couldn't tell who they were. But then I saw pictures of Trayvon Martin, and I realized that he was the one that was on the bottom. Really? Pictures she saw of him on the pony when he was 6 years old. Those are the pictures she saw of him. So she testified under oath that it was Trayvon Martin on the bottom. I mean, come on. It was just, did you see the medical examiner today?
Oh, my God. He was lost. He was all over the place. He didn't, he was
First of all, he was reading his answers. He was anticipating questions, and whether they asked him that question or not, he just looked down and just started reading. He wrote out answers, and he never showed that to the prosecution, apparently, allegedly. He certainly never showed it to the defense. I mean, this guy didn't remember anything. He didn't research anything. All of his knowledge is only based on the cases he's handled. And he was a real joke, and someone who the jury will look at when they deliberate and say, geez, how do we trust anything this guy says? This guy is a complete whack job. And he's their big star final witness? I mean, come on. Come on. And, it's a tragedy what happened here. Please, we can't, no one's saying it's not. No one's, all the attorneys that are arguing for the defense are not saying that. Everybody is sensitive to what happened here. It's horrible. It's a tragedy. But let's not suspend all intellectual thought here. Let's look at it objectively. Don't look at it along racial lines or things like that. Just look at it objectively. What did they prove? They didn't prove murder two.
No.
And after the dispatcher tells Zimmerman, we don't need you to follow him, because that's all the dispatcher, who, by the way, was not a police officer, who just said, we don't need you. Before that, the dispatcher had asked him, what's going on? Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? And he kept reporting. Zimmerman kept reporting to this guy, he's here. Now he's going here. Now I can't find him. Now he's going here. Are you following him? Yes. Oh, that's not, we don't need you to do that. Okay. After Zimmerman says okay, there's no evidence whatsoever that he didn't just stop following and went back to his car. I mean, there's nothing to contradict that. That was Zimmerman's testimony. He didn't testify. He just provided. He violated criminal law 101. And that is, if you get arrested, you don't talk to anybody. You keep your mouth shut. You ask for your attorney.
What do you need to prove murder two, Richard? What is the element of murder two?
Yeah, what they have to prove, it's very technical in the state of Florida, and they have a depravity element, so you have to prove that this murder, this killing, this homicide was done with ill will, hatred, or spite. And the way they attempted to prove it was to show that it was racially motivated and that he racially profiled Trayvon Martin and then killed him because he was black. Listen, if Zimmerman was out to kill this guy, he wouldn't have had blood coming down the back of his head and a broken nose. He just would have shot him. There wouldn't have been an altercation. There wouldn't have been anything. He just would have shot him.
Did you hear that lady that testified that she said, well, these lacerations weren't that bad? And then Don Webb
That's another mental case. That's another mental case they brought up on the stand. I don't know who's worse, her or the guy Bayo, like Rayos, Bayo. This woman, who is notorious for getting up all over the state of Florida and delivering the same testimony in every case she testifies in, and who some attorneys have opined never treated a real live patient in her entire life, just a political appointment she got. She goes in and delivers, what they told her to say. So for her to say, these were certainly not life-threatening injuries, and they were, the little abrasions, nothing, little cuts, little nothing. Well, let's take her skull and take her out there at night in the rain, in the dark, and pound her head into the cement 2-3 times, and then start punching her in the head. See how she likes that. Let's see what she would say about that.
Right, and John West it out. What is she supposed to wait till he's dead? To defend him?
That's the kind of witness the jury's going to get an instruction. We'll put witnesses up. You can believe all, part, or none of what these witnesses say. Just use your common sense. And a jury will look at a witness like that, who takes a look at the picture of him with the broken nose and the blood and everything, and say, that's nothing. Don't worry about it. It's meaningless.
Totally.
The question is, what was in his state of mind? What was in Zimmerman's state of mind at the time he shot him? Did he fear for imminent danger and death? Did he fear that? And the only testimony that comes in is that Trayvon jumped him, punched him in the face, knocked him down, got on top of him, MMA style, started pounding, grabbed his head, hit it into the cement, continued to onslaught of punches, saw the gun, told him, so you're going to die tonight or someone's going to die tonight, went to reach for it, Zimmerman screaming for help, yelling for help. I mean, the fact that, they brought these witnesses in today, and we'll talk about that in a second. He's yelling for help. He sees the guy reach for the gun. He reaches for the gun, pulls it, and shoots. I mean, that's how it went down.
It's insane. Let you listen to this witness, and we'll come back and we'll talk about this one.
Sure.
Race. in essence, when I went back and looked at the case, because I covered that trial gavel to gavel, and during it I felt that absolutely she would be found guilty, and I was stunned when she was acquitted and found not guilty, because in my opinion, seeing all the evidence at the trial, I felt that they had enough to convict her. But when I went back to figure out why the jury made that decision, I came to learn that what they really had proven was that Casey Anthony drove around with her baby in the trunk of her car, and that Casey Anthony partied and was, seemingly happy after her baby was lost and knew that her baby had died. But what they could not prove was that it was either an accident or actual cold-blooded premeditated murder. That they could not prove because there was no cause of death, because all that was left of poor little Kaylee were just bones. And therefore, with no cause of death, there was no way to say that this was or was not an accident, as her attorney had first submitted in the opening statements. So with that brings reasonable doubt.
Right.
And so it begs the question, when you're looking at putting someone's own life on the line and giving them the death penalty for finding them guilty of first-degree murder, and yet you do not know how the child died, and you're told that it was an accident, and there's no proof otherwise to dispute it being an accident. The proof that they had, the prosecution said, was duct tape that definitely led to the Anthony's garage and was definitely belonging to the Anthonys. However, with the notion that George Anthony was somehow involved in covering up the death or accidental death of this baby, then that brings up a separate doubt, which was, how did we know that it was Casey who even covered up the death or caused the death? You can't say absolutely that she acted alone or in concert with anyone. There's a lot of doubt that Jose Baez was able to raise. Whether or not we like to believe it, whether or not we as just common folk can see through a smoke screen, it's easy to do when you're sitting in the arena watching the show, but when you're actually in it in a court of law and you've got to follow the rules of law, the jury, is instructed that they have to have, absolute proof that this woman, Casey Anthony, went and premeditatedly decided to kill her child, and there just was no proof positive of that.
At least beyond a reasonable doubt.
No, not beyond a doubt.
In that trial, I didn't believe that AEG had anything to do with the wrongful death of Michael Jackson. If anything, I believe AEG is a part of Michael Jackson's death hoax. That's what I believe, okay? And because, number one, the insurance was never consummated. There was never any insurance paid on Michael Jackson. AEG did not procure any insurance. The morning of the 25th, a fax came in from Lloyd's of London that stated, we need Michael's medical records. Michael said, I ain't giving no medical records. So, therefore, Michael knew that he was leaving, okay? Michael wrote on a note, hire Conrad exclusive. That was another thing that Michael did. It was a note that he had given. AEG, they never connected Propofol and AEG. Never connected Propofol and AEG, and they never connected Conrad Murray with AEG without the presence of Michael Jackson. Now, but there is one connection, not AEG, but AEG's friend, which is Tom Barat. Tom Barat owns property and was the mortgage holder of Conrad Murray's home in Las Vegas. Now, that's kind of crazy, right? But they never brought that out in court. and they never proved that AEG knew what was going on with Conrad Murray, what Conrad Murray was doing to Michael upstairs in his locked bedroom. And I just felt like the money, $1 billion, because they didn't run Conrad Murray's credit. You can't run people's credit when they're not handling money. Okay, they're not handling money.
Well, the only person that was standing to win this lawsuit was the mother, right?
And the children, right, exactly. They will win some money, but let me tell you something. It's double jeopardy. I believe if Michael faked his death, he had to have a verdict in the criminal court, and he had to have a verdict in the civil court.
You still believing that?
Oh, of course I do.
What? You're kidding me.
Of course I do. I think it's
okay,
wonderful.
right.
I do. You just don't know enough. You just don't know enough, that's all. You're not a part of our inner circle.
I know more in 3 months than I knew in 5 years.
Oh, well then, but that's still not enough.
That's all you need to know. It's getting in and getting out.
Steve Brown did say some unflattering things via his Twitter account about you, as I told you. And I'll just bring that up to date so the listeners know what I'm talking about. Somehow the link of something of the show got linked to Stacy Brown, and he replied words to the effect of, Tom Mesereau saved the pedophile, words to that effect. I want to get your response on that.
Well, if Stacy Brown doesn't like me, that makes me feel very good. Stacy Brown, I'd like more enemies like that. Stacy Brown, in my opinion, based on everything I saw and heard, was in the prosecution's pocket during the 2005 trial. He wanted Michael Jackson convicted. He wanted him convicted. He published this ridiculous book that was one of the most poorly written books I've ever read towards the end of the trial. I think the timing was designed to hurt Michael Jackson and increase the chances he would be convicted. And he was no friend of the family as far as I'm concerned, and no friend of Michael Jackson. That's my opinion. And he seemed in utter shock when Michael Jackson was acquitted. In fact, I think he went on court TV and used the words that, I'm shocked. I was told by someone else that he was with the prosecutor when they called Gavin Arvizo to let him know that Michael Jackson had been acquitted. That's what I was told. I wasn't there. I don't really know. But as far as I'm concerned, he was one of Michael Jackson's enemies. He wanted him convicted from everything I saw. And he's no friend of mine, and I'm no friend of his. And I don't even think he's worthy to be called a journalist. I think he's a wannabe tabloid reporter.
Yes, I second that motion. Stacy Brown called himself a friend of the family to him during the trial back in 2005. Do you know any information like that? If he was a friend, he certainly wasn't a good friend because of the negative things he did and said. Maybe some of the family members, at least.
I have never understood how he could call himself a friend of the family. His family members.
Very interesting. Okay, Alex, yesterday or the day before, former spokesman for Subway, Jared Foogle, I believe his name is, he pleaded guilty to Foogle. He pleaded guilty to child sex abuse charges. I mean, talk about the rise and fall of somebody. Wow. What did you think when you heard this?
Well, first of all, this may come as an absolute shock to everybody. I have never heard of this guy Foogle. Never once. I'm not kidding. I mean, I buy an occasional sandwich at Subway, but, when I was a kid, I was watching television, and a commercial came on. And I said, hey, Dad, why do they have commercials on TV? And he said, oh, that's in case you need to use the restroom, get something to eat. So I don't spend my time staring at commercials. And a Subway commercial wouldn't particularly leave an impression on my thinking. So I never heard of this guy. But having heard of him or not, this guy is obviously a very disturbed individual. I mean, he's arranging to have sex with kids. He's paying for people to bring kids for him to have sex. He had thousands of videos, thousands of pornographic images of young kids. I mean, this guy's living on a different planet. I mean, where do people like this come from? How does somebody develop that mentality? What happened to him in his life that he could have arrived at this awful station? Well, I don't know how it happened or why it happened, but it happened, and he's going to spend the next 12 years in jail because of this.
Yeah.
Is it because Beth Karas that he pleaded guilty that he's going to spend 12 years as opposed to maybe 30, 40 years?
Oh, yeah.
In your opinion?
He reached this plea agreement, I understand, shortly before court. I don't know if the judge has accepted the agreement yet.
Right.
Once the judge accepts it, and I believe he will, it's going to be somewhere between 5 and 12 and a half years. That was the agreement. But his exposure was more, and so, maybe he's hoping that he'll actually do somewhere on the lower end. I don't know federal sentencing well, how much time you actually have to do. And if it's an indeterminate or a determinate sentence. Is it a determinate sentence? Do you know, Alex?
No, those are determinate sentences. And you have to do, 98% of the sentencing. And the low end is 5 years. And the high end is 12 years if the judge accepts the recommendation of the prosecution or the defense. But the judge has a right to say, you know what, I'm not abiding by these particular sentencing arrangements, and the judge can give him up to 30 years.
Yeah,
and
okay, right.
When you're engaged in this behavior, you know what? You should be in jail for a substantial period of time. This is not acceptable behavior by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
And Joseph Scott, your take on this?
I've just got a couple of points. I think, from my perspective, I don't know that I've ever seen a case that has, such as this, involving child pornography, where there is so much evidence and someone has received so little time. That indicates to me, at least, that relative to the wheeling and dealing that has been going on, that there are bigger fish to fry. I think that this is going to be very interesting to see develop. I hope that the media will stay on this. One more thing that's even, as if it couldn't get more disturbing, I've read one report where Foogle had gone on an international tour for Subway, and there is some indication apparently that he procured children for sex potentially all around the world. I think that this could extend further than just the U.S. It would not surprise me in the least bit, particularly given his profile. You can look back to somebody like Gary Glitter, for instance. If Interpol was not involved in this at this point, conducting an investigation. And, a person's going to do what they're going to do if they have this kind of pathology going on. But Subway is really trying hard to distance themselves. They put out a couple of statements now. You look at this internationally, and they've essentially, given him means to go around the world and do this. And if they're from a civil perspective, I think this could get really, really nasty. I don't know. I'm probably speaking out of turn here because I'm not an attorney. But for me, that's just a couple of things that kind of struck me. I'm just overwhelmed by the amount of just this horrible, horrible evidence that's involved in this case, and he's getting so little time. So it's going to be very interesting from my perspective, Susan.
In any event,
good.
when you met, thank you. When you first met Miss Arias, what was that encounter like? Take us back to that day.
Well, I kind of really describe it at length in the book, and you probably wouldn't want my long-winded answer. But the short answer kind of was that, back then I was a capital attorney at the public defender's office, is kind of what I already referred to, right? And you get this case, and it's a file with a name, basically. It's being transferred from another indigent defense group, and you don't really know very much. The client is Jodi Arias, and I had some ideas that at that time the coverage involved her being on CBS 48 hours. And so there was this, documentary where she was interviewed, and some of Mr. Alexander's friends were interviewed, and family were interviewed, things of that nature. So, in many ways, apart from that CBS special, this was just another case, an ordinary, file, and it was just going down to meet another client. And at that time, it wasn't that big a deal. Although certainly, Miss Arias was unique amongst capital defendants, not having a prior criminal history, things of that nature. So, but by and large, although she was a unique case, it was not. She was not the infamous Miss Arias that she is today.
Right.
Back then, right? Because back in 2009, really nobody knew who she was.
They were actually more paying attention to Top Mom, Casey Anthony, at that time.
Yes, indeed, right? And those comparisons got drawn later, but back at that point in time, it was just another case and just another trip to the women's jail out here in Maricopa County.
Right. So you didn't think much of it at that time.
No, like I say, it wasn't what it became.
Did you ever think, now look, you have a girl, she's being accused of something heinous. She is pretty, at the time of her MySpace pictures at least, some would say, some do say. It looks like it has the potential to be another Casey Anthony, except in the fact of it's not a whodunit. You never thought to yourself this might be a media frenzy?
Well, back then, no. As time went on, obviously, I knew the media was gonna cover it. At a certain point in time, maybe 2010, maybe late 2009, HLN network had applied to wanting to show it and live stream it and all that stuff, and so I got a sense of it. But back then, no, because there's so many cases, I mean, obviously, maybe that some people view her as attractive would be something that would catch their eye. But, the case went to trial for various reasons that I detail in my book, nearly, 4.5 years or so after the killing. So to me, it's still amazing, I guess, that the interest became so great.
Yeah, but I think, when we did that second episode where the first guy in the door on a Wednesday afternoon at about noon was a rabbi, I don't know how, I was just so blown away. And then after that, there was a fellow who was a military guy, there was a teacher, and then a fellow who walked in completely naked. And at no time in my journalistic training or education at Michigan State University was I taught how to deal with somebody who walked into a sting operation essentially naked, and it was mind-boggling. And with each investigation, there were more and more people who came from all walks of life, people who would be standing next to you at a grocery store or the dry cleaners on a Saturday morning, but who do bizarre things and say things and get caught up in this in a way that I would never have imagined. Honestly, Jordan, at the beginning of this, I thought, we'd do this once or twice, and then nobody would show up. I'd be like the Maytag repairman, taking a nap in the kitchen counter.
Not to be.
But every time we did it, we had more people. It got to a point where we had an investigation set up on the Jersey Shore, and a guy walks in, and he puts his marijuana out in the counter, and he's talking to the decoy, and I walk in, and he looks at me. Before I can say a word, he says, "Oh, you're Chris Hansen." I said, "Well, how do you know that?" He said, "Well, I never miss an episode. When I do, I download them from the internet." It was stunning to me.
And what year was this about?
This was probably
07?
07, 08. You know, I think we did. The last original To Catch a Predator was 08, and then of course they were recut and re-aired multiple times on MSNBC and around the world. And you know, even today, I mean, we did this investigation in Fairfield, Connecticut for Hansen versus Predator, and
right,
we had
which is
everybody
the new one,
from
right?
the new one, right? And we had everybody from an insurance executive in Boston to guys from Queens to a fellow who I had met on the commuter train from Connecticut to New York. I mean, it's
someone that you personally met on the way.
Personally met on a train, years ago on the commuter train. And
you would have no idea that later that would be.
No. I mean, it was stunning to me. And so when I saw him on the monitor, I didn't recognize him. I hadn't seen him in a couple of years. And so when I walked out to confront him, he looks at me and says, Chris, no, it's not what you think. You can't do this to me. And the crew thinks he just knows me from television. And then suddenly I realize this is a fellow I know from the train. And so, again, it's the nature of this in terms of these fellows coming from all walks of life. And now, imagine in the beginning we merely put decoys on chat rooms on AOL and Yahoo. But now there are so many other social platforms, Kik and Badu, and I mean, there are dozens and dozens and dozens that didn't exist before. So it's a whole new
generation
out there. And that's why we decided to go out there and do it again. I mean, it's a question that I was asked most on social media, in spite of all these other shows I'm working on. It's like, when are you going to do another Predator? And so we decided to, in fact, do it. And that's, why we're at where we're at now.
There's been a lot of questions that people have asked me, why don't you ever go after women? As we see in every day, especially in these last 10 years or so, the teachers that are women teachers are just growing by leaps and bounds, and I'm sure you realize that. Was it a case that you just couldn't find any? You didn't want to go for that? I mean,
well, no, it's honestly, we had one situation in Georgia years ago where a fellow said that he had a woman, his date, who wanted to be involved in a situation to meet a young girl for a sexual liaison. And I think he was just using that as a ploy to get, to the girl. But the experts will tell you that when it comes to female predators, you're more likely to see the teacher scenario that you mentioned earlier, because female predators do not like the anonymity. They like to know who they're going after. Male predators like the anonymity. So it wasn't that we didn't try to expose that end of it. It's just that I don't think it's as prevalent for women as it is for men. And does it happen? Yes.
The chat version,
I wrote about it in the book. Yeah, it does happen online, but it's not nearly as prevalent as men going after younger boys or girls.